Now we'll talk about Hungarian architect whose birthday is today, and that's the reason why we talk about him. I'm talking about IMRE MAKOWECZ. Just a second, let me activate the slideshow. So IMRE MAKOWECZ was born in 1935, and he died in 2011. And you know, because this is what I do, I pay homage to important architects, both alive and who are not any longer with us, but sometimes also not just to architects, like in the case of Benoit Mandelbrot. By the way of him, I showed the examples of what might be called, you know, fractal architecture. So let's read a little bit about IMRE MAKOWECZ, and I mention again today, November 20th, when IMRE MAKOWECZ was born. Also, Kenneth Frampton was born 91 years ago. So let's wish him happy birthday, and also let's wish happy birthday to IMRE MAKOWECZ, who was a Hungarian architect active in Europe from the late 1950s onward. MAKOWECZ was born and died in Budapest. He attended the Technical University of Budapest. He was founder and eternal and executive president. An ambitious wording, eternal and executive president of the Hungarian Academy of Arts. He was an award-winning architect, having won WYBL prize, I don't know what that is, and the Kossuth prize, Stendhal Imre prize, and Primissima award, among many others. His architecture is very original. Let's read a little more about him. He was one of the most prominent proponents of organic architecture, but his organicism is very different from the one of Frank Lloyd Wright. As such, his buildings attempt to work with the natural surroundings rather than triumph over them. Frank Lloyd Wright and Rudolf Steiner are both strong influences, as is traditional Hungarian art. His work began as a critique of communist ideology and the brutal uniformity of system building, but after the fall of the communist regime in 1989, it became a comment on the nature of globalization and corporate culture in its attempts to refer to and build on Hungarian national archetypes. I think his resistance to globalization and corporate culture is a valid one. The problem is that today the relationship with tradition is perhaps difficult. As Kenzo Tange very well said, it's very difficult to remain explicitly connected to that tradition and still belong to the time we live in. It's truly a difficult and complex subject. So MAKOWECZ was continuing the work and ideas of the architects of Hungarian Art Nouveau and National Romanticism. The first English language monograph on his work, IMRE MAKOWECZ, The Wings of the Soul by Edwin Heathcote, was published in 1997. More recently, his work has been examined in the broader context of Hungarian culture, to which belongs organic cinema. I know nothing about organic cinema, but now I am curious. MAKOWECZ was a devout Roman Catholic. Here he is, and we have to salute him and appreciate him from bringing to the attention of the rest of the world architecture from, the edge of the world, the edge of Europe, in a way, East Europe. And he was able to do this, and he was very appreciated in Great Britain. Paolo Portoghesi wrote about him. So his architecture did have an impact beyond the frontiers of Eastern Europe or Hungary. This is a composite drawing of a portrait of him, incorporating fragments of his buildings in his face, and this rather accurate portrait of him. Anyway, So happy birthday to you, Mr. Makowecz. He tried to individualize his architecture for the specific place he lived and built in. And not too many architects do this. And actually, many people are very skeptical about the possibility of, nationalism or, an architecture, modern architecture with national traits. But he, in some of his best works, I think he was able to be both local and global. Some drawings by IMRE MAKOWECZ. Yes, indeed, it is some kind of a romanticism or a romantic spirit that is almost difficult to contemplate as being still possible in today's world. But if his influences were, Rudolf Steiner and Theosophy and, Frank Lloyd Wright, obviously we are dealing with influences that have some difficulties to connect with our present. He also loved Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst. And, there are cultural references that reverberate beyond the limits of architecture in his work. Now, this house, I don't know if I have image. I do, but I have better resolution. Again, the problem is how to build in such a way that tradition is not discarded, is not neglected, and at the same time it doesn't become formal or decorative or advocating an excessive localism. It's not easy. It's not easy because it's very, very, very possible to fall into the limits of localism. And localism, I think, is as deficient as globalism. In fact, any ism, I think, is restrictive. And if possible, we should avoid anything having to do with an ism, including tectonism, blobism, and all those things that Patrick Schumacher thought that left behind the transitional so-called styles, postmodernism, deconstructivism. Anything with an ism is already a step forward towards dogma, and that's a problem. When the system takes over and becomes stiff, I think we are very close to distancing ourselves from freedom. But his research is, varied, and the problem is, another problem is that how can you build today a narrative architecture which achieves avoiding literal meanings. Architecture and literature, this is an interesting subject to explore, but I think in architecture, explicit literalness could be dangerous. It's also dangerous even in the field of literature itself. Literal meanings usually are a risk of becoming decorative and rather facile. A Shark restaurant in this place, Valence, I don't know if I pronounce well, from 1965. These are early works by IMRE MAKOWECZ. Although he had obvious cultural interests and even spiritual interests, unfortunately, life in the second half of the 20th century didn't have so much interest in spirit, and there were programs like a restaurant or a ski hut or camping and things like this, secular functions and secular buildings. cottages. This from 1965. I like the fact that, you know, he assumed matter, he assumed gravity, he assumed the stone, he assumed the wood, and worked with them in convincing ways. Cultural Center from 1972. Already we are here on a dangerous path. Dangerous because the world at that time in 1970s wouldn't have this sort of thing. This, yes, did happen, you know, previously in previous centuries, but you know, in the 70s Europe, this was a, you know, required a lot of courage to do something like this. But now we saw in the previous presentation with fractal geometries that Michael Hansmeyer, in fact, but in a more abstracted way, is somehow moving in this direction. The problem here is that the literal meanings are perhaps too explicit and they risk to become decorative. And if you, in the absence of knowing what they represent, you know, it's very difficult to connect with them. But the kind of organicism, and he was not the only architect, there were other architects who followed on his path, and maybe there were also original creators who experimented, you know, in approximately similar ways, but not necessarily influenced by IMRE Makowecz, I don't know. But I do have a book on organic Hungarian architecture, and there were other architects who were kind of in similar ways. And this required courage. And it was an architecture that might be, you know, uncomfortable for other people from Europe or beyond Europe. But who knows, maybe in the future, this kind of architecture will be seen differently. It surprised many people, it's true, because when we refer to organic architecture, we think immediately of Frank Lloyd Wright. But here we have an organic architecture from Europe, from Hungary, and it's a different kind of organicism. Another, you know, secular building can function, a restaurant. You know, what can you do? This building, unfortunately, I think was destroyed. But you know, from this picture, I would say that again, a courageous building from that period, 1970s, because who would build like this, you know, anywhere actually, because there was also a certain mythology. It wasn't just the building itself, but the meanings behind the building. Look, it was devastated by fire. You know, yes, we build such buildings for industrial reasons, or but here it was an attempt from IMRE Makowecz to bring this kind of you know, organic architecture, not for global or globalist purposes, but you know, serving a local function in a local context. And he built with wood, and wood is fragile. And you know, if this was in concrete, we would not have arrived at this. But you know, IMRE Makowecz was not fond of concrete. He was fond of wood, and he knew very well how to work with wood. And he had a craftsman to work adequately with wood. But what can you do? Fire is fire, and wood does not like fire, and fire does not like wood. And you know, look what it was in before the fire and what happened after the fire. Now the Villa Richter, also an interesting building, and yes, you can feel the influence of Rudolf Steiner. And IMRE Makowecz was knowledgeable about theosophy and you know, anthroposophy. And yes, his architecture does belong to, you know, Eastern Europe with ramifications also in a larger culture, meaning beyond architecture itself. This mortuary chapel is probably my favorite building from his oeuvre because it's truly primal and archetypal, and it's also close to bioarchitecture. It's like an architectural uterus, and I think he was able here to unite the sacred with the profane, and the liturgical in a way with the physiological. That's why I call it an uterus. It's a womb, and maybe the womb was the primal inspiration of the first church. It's, I think, a very important structure. Here is the drawing. I imagine he did it, and unfortunately, I don't have many great pictures of it. But I think in this building he was able to move beyond, the descriptiveness of literal, representations or meanings, and achieve a heartfelt and deeply felt archetypal architecture. The problem is when this primal architecture becomes too conveniently decorative. I think here is a difficult transition from that primal archetype or almost architecture to something that becomes a little bit too conveniently decorative. It's difficult, but all in all, the power of the womb and the power of the architectural uterus, I think, remains. At least when I look at these black and white pictures, I feel that here there is no room for the convenience of decoration. Now, a tourist lodge or tourist lodges in Visegrad, 1977. Again, it's an architecture that is so very different from almost from anything else done in Europe and beyond Europe. But again, I have a certain resistance towards when that roughness, the raw architecture that is connected with architecture is replaced or becomes too sweet or too conveniently decorative. I think that is a problem because it becomes literal and somehow too explicitly connected with what we know today of postmodernism. And this is also true of the architecture of Paolo Portoghesi. Paolo Portoghesi, who wrote about IMRE MAKOWECZ. Otherwise, there are interesting things here, and I wonder, but again, how can we bring back figuration or sculptural figuration into our buildings without losing the connection, the organic connection with the present. Camping complex and recreation center in the same place, Visegrad, 1978. And you see, I mean, there are symbols here at the top of the column, which I'm curious to learn about, but I wonder in what way do these symbols connect with the very function of the building, which is this, a camping complex. So, if we lived in a different century and you imagine some kind of warriors or who knows what, medieval man, wandering through the building, I would have understood. But in what way can I connect myself as a camping man, happy-go-lucky camping man at the end of the 20th century to connect with the gravity of these symbols and with the history and with their meaning? I don't know. You see, again, it's a secular function, a ski lift house. You know, in my opinion, IMRE Makowecz deserved different kinds of, and he did have the chance to build a few buildings for, you know, for a church and a chapel and so on. But he also built, you know, for these explicitly, you know, secular functions. I like this building very much. You know, it has the aleatory movement of the pieces of wood on the, and you don't have you know, the predictable relationship between the wall and the roof. Here the roof becomes wall and the wall becomes roof, which I like, and the covering is very convincing, particularly from the perspective of, you know, sustainability. At that time, there was no talk about sustainability, but this building is very convincing. I only hope it will be protected properly and no fire will damage it. But it is, in my opinion, an excellent building. Visegrad Sports Hall. I don't know if I have here enough pictures of, yeah, I do. Again, it's difficult, I think, to remain within the characteristics of this architectural language and assume functions like a sports hall. You know, what is a sports hall? We know what a sports hall is, but this could have been the nave of a church, the way it looks with its Gothicism. The community center in Bach from 1985, it's actually a similar building to the one we saw. And this series of buildings I admire, particularly for the way that it dilutes the frontier or the distance between the wall and the roof. There is symmetry, but you don't perceive the building as being symmetrical. And the symmetry has symbolic, metaphorical, and poetical meanings here, you know, like two wings. He benefited from working with, you know, very skillful craftsmen. You cannot do something like this because you cannot depict in the precise position every single, you know, wood element there. You have to rely on good craftsmen to do something like this. You only give them a strategy of design and then they follow it, and the result is what we look at. And this is a building from the 20th century, but it could have been built in another century. And I like this fact that it's almost atemporal, it's ahistorical. A church. These are very unique churches. I mean, who would build churches like this in today's world or in his time? Not many. You know, he had a vision. You might not agree with his vision, but he had a vision. And this romantic nationalism or national romanticism is clearly shown in a building like this. Also, the fact that he was a devout Roman, Catholic. Another church, the Holy Spirit Church, talks. This is one of his most impressive buildings. And I like the fact that at the top of the church, we identify both the sun and the moon. This is rather unusual, I would say. I'm not a great scholar of religion, and but the presence of the moon there is shows a duality which is probably rather in conflict with with the teachings of Christianity in whatever form. I see the more a quest for the conjunction of opposites. Although at Chartres also there are two towers in on the western facade, one being identified as with the sun and the other one with the moon. Here we also have these two, but it's interesting that he placed there very courageously, I would say, the moon. So, in my opinion, this building transcends the literal or the known or the explicit requirements of the very religion he was serving. Also, the bulbous reality of the building, its organic, physiology, if I am to call it so, it's almost sensuous, and there is an opulence, plenitude that somehow one might say is not of a spiritual order. But I think he was. I don't know truly a lot about IMRE Makowecz, but I have a feeling here there is some influence coming from Carl Jung, who was very interested in alchemy, in the conjunction of opposites, conjunctio oppositorum. And I see in this church something like this, the sun and the moon, and then the two halves, which are, opulent and, sensuous, like two maternal breasts. It's something at work here that is both religious and somehow almost anti-religious, or I don't know how to describe it, but it's a conjunction of at least two powerful opposite tendencies. One thing is for sure, his buildings are not just about form, and they make you think, they make you ask questions. When I lived in New York City, I was connected with an architecture gallery storefront for art and architecture, and the founder of that gallery, Kyung Park, he admired IMRE Makowecz, and at that time IMRE Makowecz contributed a few times, and he even had an exhibition at Storefront for Art and Architecture in the 80s, at the end of the 20th century. A secondary school, 1988. There are interesting things here too. So a very original architecture happened in Hungary at a time when, yes, Europe was, I would say, devastated by postmodernism. But here, an architect like IMRE Makowecz was not just playing with forms or with borrowed forms from other cultures. He was nourishing himself from the culture of his own land. a theater and Hungarian community center in Lendava in Slovenia. So this is not in Hungary any longer. The Hungarian pavilion at the Seville Expo in 1992 in Spain. Very different from most other buildings, which, you know, even during postmodernism, you know, celebrated rather predictable modernity. Here was something else. Look at all the buildings around it. This building stands out. The only thing that I have some problems with are those that are too explicitly, you know, literal or decorative. Otherwise, it's a very interesting pavilion, you know, with this, you know, large room or hall, you know, almost like a cave. And then, and I called it before a uterus or a womb. And then these slender towers. It's an interesting architecture and very different from what we see around. Impeccably built also. And look at this tree here. Contemplate its roots from underneath. A church, another church from 1995. I see the influence of anthroposophy from Rudolf Steiner here and the Goetheanum. But still, there are specificities which do not belong at all to that connection. But my perceptions and the perceptions of anyone are actually, you know, the result of living at a certain time in a certain place. Who knows how this architecture might be perceived in, let's say, 50 years from now, or the other way, looking the other way. Who knows how this architecture might have been perceived, let's say, a few centuries earlier. That we will never know. But perhaps the question is worth asking. Stepaneum, so kind of an interesting building and almost anachronistically built. When was it built? 1995. But if the mentality of the world moves in the direction of you know, appreciating more local values, it's possible that the architecture of IMRE MAKOWECZ would gain you know, in importance and yeah, would make us understand it not as some kind of an exotic you know, otherness, but something that might become one day you know, not the rule, but in a way the path to follow. Although I have to say, when trees become too literally depicted, although abstracted to an extent, but not sufficiently, I think there is a problem. And this was the problem that Paolo Portoghesi was confronted with also. It's true that in the Gothic cathedral, there was talk about the forest of columns, but it was not a literal forest. It was not a figurative forest. It was an abstracted forest. The level of abstraction could have been higher, in my opinion. A community center from 1996. This one is here. We see the, the explicitness of tradition without leaving too many doubts. It's very difficult. It is very difficult. And I thought many times about what Kenzo Tange said, that you cannot build in the present following explicitly on the path of tradition. You have you might start from tradition, but you have to make a transformation and metamorphosis. Otherwise, the work, might be nostalgic, but that's not sufficient. But it's true, he made this statement in the second half of the 20th century, in the 60s, I guess. But I don't think things changed since then. But IMRE Makowecz lived and worked at a time when in the world there was what was called postmodernism. So we have to look at his work also in the context of postmodernism. But I think his best works transcend, the limitations and the definitions of postmodernism. In a way, we have to struggle for an architecture which is both local and global and atemporal. It belongs to a certain time, it belongs to a certain place, but at the same time, it transcends them, if possible. This is a funeral chapel in Romania, in Sfântu Gheorghe, from 1996. Sorry, I don't have more pictures. I just found these two pictures. Anyway, the Onion House Cultural Center in Mako, 1995. I think when he assumed levels of modernity more courageously, his works, being rooted in the traditions of his country and his culture and his place, gained something, almost something cosmic somehow when I look at this building. A swimming pool from 2000s, a large complex for loisir, for pleasure, for what can we do, for, for health too, for sport. But there is, with great difficulty, room for mysticism in this field. A Roman Catholic church in Miercurea Ciuc in Romania from 2001. Perhaps one could write a paper or something about the dualities of the architecture of IMRE Makowecz, because I see almost continuously, two halves. I see dualities, and they reverberate beyond the form. Actually, I think they arrive at meanings that transcend form. A Reformed church on Donath Street in Cluj, again, Romania. So this is the third building he built in Transylvania. To me, this is problematic because I don't know. I mean, I love the Middle Ages, but it's difficult for me to conceive an architecture that is literally or descriptively, having, little towers like these, and it's something that, in my opinion, is a little bit too facile. But again, the interior has appropriately, I would say, longing for that maternal uterus or maternal womb, which the primeval cave probably evoked. The Pancho Arena, you see here again the duality that I mentioned, and the rift between the two sides. The Pancho Arena from the 2-foot carved Felix, sorry for the pronunciation. Now the building is as it is, but the fence around it is rather static and predictable. Maybe he didn't do the fence, I don't know. Also, being a stadium, I think he achieved a position of courage that few would have expected. When you contemplate the work of IMRE Makowecz, you'd have a hard time to imagine that he would do a stadium. Well, that's what he did here, and how do you marry tradition with such a large-scale building? I wish I had other pictures, because I see here, interesting structure, but I don't have. I have here now only, this fragment. Well, the world is returning to wood now because of sustainability problems and so on, but there is a problem. Wood is beautiful and wood is eternally at our disposal, but we also need the trees because we need oxygen. So how much can we afford to continue to cut down trees and forests? The Hungarian architect, I mean, his own house, which is now a memorial house open to the public. You see the dualities that I mentioned even here, where a window becomes a sum of two parts. Explicitly, shown as being two, or to use the language of Peter Eisenman, two-ness. Here there is also a segment of a spiral, which in itself, the presence of the spiral in the work of IMRE Makowecz could make one think of larger meanings. And almost everywhere the two wings appear in many of his works, perhaps as a desideratum, a longing for loftier zones of existence. A chair, which is actually a throne. I see he designed it with someone. I myself designed some ceremonial chairs, also kind of thrones. And the very idea to design a throne in modern days Europe is challenging and interesting. And this is the last image of this presentation. Let's wish him happy birthday, and thank you for being here today.